I drove up to my mountain cabin expecting to find an empty house and a quiet meeting with the realtor to prepare the property for a long-term rental. Instead, I walked through the front door and found my daughter-in-law's parents relaxing inside, drinking my wine, eating at my heirloom table, and laughing with 3 of their relatives as though they owned the place. Brenda looked up at me with a smile and casually said, "Sarah told us we could stay. This house will be hers eventually anyway." Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's get back to what happened next. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue, and I didn't waste time trying to explain why they had no right to be there. I simply looked around at the mess, turned around, and quietly decided that everyone involved was about to learn the difference between family and ownership. Earlier that morning, I had driven through the Blue Ridge Mountains with my spare key in my hand, expecting nothing more complicated than meeting the real estate agent and getting the cabin ready for tenants. As soon as I unlocked the front door, however, I knew something was wrong. Instead of silence, I heard loud laughter and the unmistakable sound of glasses clinking together when I stepped into the living room. I froze. Brenda and her husband Larry were stretched out comfortably on my furniture while 3 of their cousins chatted around them. They had opened my best bottle of Cabernet, and greasy pizza boxes covered the heirloom cherry wood coffee table that had been passed down through my family for generations. Brenda didn't even bother getting up. She laughed as though my arrival were the amusing part of the afternoon. "Diane, what are you doing here?" she asked. "Sarah said we could stay for a few weeks. The place was just sitting empty anyway." A sharp ache settled in my chest, but it wasn't grief. It was disappointment. My son Jason knew exactly what that cabin meant to me. He knew I had purchased it as part of my retirement plan and that I intended to rent it out for steady income. Still, I said nothing. I didn't demand an explanation or start an argument. Instead, I walked into the kitchen where the sink overflowed with dirty dishes. Crumbs covered the counters, and signs of careless living were everywhere. Brenda followed me with a wine glass in her hand, swirling the Cabernet as though she belonged there. With a smug smile, she told me not to get upset because Sarah had explained that the cabin would belong to Jason and her someday anyway. According to Brenda, they were simply getting an early start, enjoying what would eventually become their inheritance. She delivered those words with complete confidence, looking at me as though I were the unwelcome guest standing in someone else's house. At that moment, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to argue with her, and I certainly wasn't going to waste my energy trying to convince someone to respect me at 68 years old. I still had patience for gardening, painting, and all the quiet hobbies I enjoyed. But I no longer had patience for blatant disrespect. Without saying another word, I turned around and walked out. As I reached the driveway, Brenda actually called after me, asking if I could take the trash with me on my way out. They believed I was leaving because I had been defeated. They imagined quiet Diane was driving home to cry about the situation. None of them realized I was already reviewing every financial arrangement, every account, and every authorization I had ever established for my son's family. Jason called 3 times while I drove back toward Charlotte. I ignored every call. My son wasn't a cruel man. The problem was that he hated conflict so much he often solved it by volunteering my generosity instead of setting boundaries with his wife. By the time I arrived home, I'd already begun seeing the situation more clearly than I ever had before. My townhouse greeted me with the peaceful order I had always worked hard to maintain. I made myself a cup of tea and looked around the quiet rooms, reminding myself that this home was still entirely mine. Sarah had mistaken my silence for weakness for years. She managed every dollar in their household, influenced Jason's career decisions, and never hesitated to comment on my belongings. Whenever she looked at my antiques, she'd smile politely and mention how outdated they seemed, as though she were already deciding which pieces she would eventually replace. For years, I simply smiled and let those remarks pass. That day, something finally changed. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into the savings account I had created for Jason and my grandchildren. The account held $60,000 that I had set aside for the down payment on their first home. Although Jason had authority to access the account, the money itself still belonged to me. Without hesitation, I transferred every dollar back into my personal account. I wasn't stealing anything. I was withdrawing a gift that had been offered in good faith, but no longer rested on mutual respect. I didn't stop there. I contacted the cleaning company that had maintained the mountain cabin for years and canceled every appointment scheduled over the next month. If Brenda, Larry, and the rest of their family wanted to stay there without permission, they could clean up after themselves. Then I logged into my utility accounts and canceled every automatic payment connected to the property. Electricity, water, and gas would all be shut off once the billing cycle ended because I had no intention of financing someone else's unauthorized vacation. After closing my laptop, I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. My heartbeat remained calm. The hardest part still lay ahead. Sooner or later, Sarah was going to realize that the inheritance she believed was guaranteed had just become something very different. The following morning, Sarah showed up at my townhouse without calling first. She pushed the front door open before I had even finished watering the African violets sitting on the kitchen windowsill. Her face was flushed with anger, and she wasted no time getting to the point. "Diane, what was that yesterday?" she demanded. "My mother is devastated. You walked out without saying a word, and now they feel completely unwelcome." I continued watering the plants for another moment before setting the watering can down. Only then did I look at her. "They are unwelcome, Sarah," I said calmly. "It's my house." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "We're family," she replied. "Jason agreed they could stay there. We thought you'd be happy the cabin was finally being used." I met her eyes without raising my voice. "Jason has absolutely no authority to give someone permission to use my property," I said. "And neither do you." Sarah folded her arms across her chest, clearly expecting me to soften the moment she challenged me. "You're being selfish," she shot back. "That cabin is going to belong to us eventually anyway. Why are you making such a big issue out of this?" I remained perfectly still. "Eventually isn't today," I answered quietly. "And whether that cabin ever belongs to anyone besides me is a decision I continue making every single day." For the first time, the confidence in her expression shifted ever so slightly. Instead of responding to what I'd just said, she immediately changed the subject. "Speaking of decisions," she said, "Jason noticed the savings account is empty. We were supposed to close on our new house next week." I walked over to the kitchen table and gently pulled out the chair across from mine. "You can sit down if you'd like." She stayed exactly where she was. I nodded once before explaining. "That money was always a gift. Sarah, every gift comes with certain expectations, even if they're never written on paper. The expectation attached to mine was mutual respect, since the two of you decided it was acceptable to hand out my cabin to your relatives without even asking me. I assumed you no longer needed my financial support. If you're comfortable managing my property without my permission, then you're certainly capable of managing your own down payment." She narrowed her eyes, clearly searching for an argument strong enough to change my mind. Normally, raising her voice or creating enough tension had been enough to make me compromise. This time, however, the room remained completely calm, and my refusal to become emotional unsettled her far more than any shouting ever could. Without another word, she turned, stormed toward the front door, and slammed it behind her. A few hours later, Jason arrived. The difference between the two of them was immediately obvious. He looked exhausted. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of everything that had happened. and when he sat down at my kitchen table, it was in the exact chair where he used to finish his homework after school all those years ago. "Mom," he said quietly, "does it really have to be like this? Sarah's falling apart. Her parents refused to leave the cabin, and now we don't even have the money for the new house." I slid a plate of homemade cookies across the table toward him before asking the one question that mattered most. "Jason, did you give them the key?" His eyes dropped immediately. "Sarah said it would be fine," he admitted. "They just wanted a change of scenery." I gave a slow nod. "And did you ever ask why they were drinking my wine and treating my furniture like it belonged to them?" He said nothing. He didn't deny it. He simply stared at the table because he already knew there wasn't a reasonable answer. "I've already hired a realtor," I continued. "The first walkthrough for prospective long-term tenants is scheduled for next week. Your in-laws need to be out of the cabin by Sunday night." Jason shook his head almost immediately. "They can't leave that fast. Brenda unpacked everything. They were planning to stay for at least 3 weeks. I offered him a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Then they'll be sitting in the dark starting Monday." His head lifted. "What do you mean?" "I canceled the utilities." The color drained from his face. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can." I kept my voice completely even. "My name is on every account. I'm not paying electricity, water, and gas, so people who mocked me in my own house can enjoy a free vacation." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Jason looked as though he wanted to argue, but every argument disappeared before it reached his lips because he understood one simple truth. Everything connected to that cabin belonged to me. I stood up from the table, quietly bringing the conversation to an end. "I've already made my decision." There was nothing left to negotiate. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years. Lying in bed, I realized how much of my life I had spent confusing peace with avoiding conflict. I'd worked so hard to keep everyone happy that I slowly allowed myself to become the easiest person to disappoint. The calm I felt now wasn't the result of everyone getting along. It came from finally protecting something that should never have required defending in the first place. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about Sunday. I wasn't driving back to the mountains for another conversation. I was going there to change the locks. Sunday evening arrived with clear skies over the Blue Ridge Mountains as I drove steadily toward the cabin. This time, I wasn't coming to debate, negotiate, or ask anyone to leave voluntarily. I had already arranged for a locksmith to meet me at the property because, as far as I was concerned, the discussion had ended the moment my generosity was mistaken for permission. When I turned onto the gravel driveway, the cabin was brightly lit. Music drifted through the open windows, and I could hear laughter long before I stepped out of my car. Nothing about the scene suggested they believed I would actually follow through. They were completely convinced I'd been bluffing. The locksmith was already waiting beside his truck. I thanked him for coming, then walked calmly toward the front door. Brenda answered wearing a bathrobe with a glass of red wine still in her hand. She smiled as though my arrival were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Back again. Diane," she said. "We already told you we're staying through the end of the month." I didn't respond to her greeting. Instead, I stepped inside with the locksmith following behind me. Brenda immediately frowned. "What is this? Who's this man?" I answered without changing my tone. "This is Mr. Miller. He's here to replace every deadbolt on the front and back doors." The smile disappeared from her face almost instantly, before she could respond. Larry appeared from the hallway looking slightly unsteady, clearly having enjoyed more than a few drinks. "You can't throw us out," he protested. "It's Sunday night." I glanced down at my watch. "It's 8 o'clock, I said calmly. "You have 30 minutes to pack everything you brought into this house. Anything still inside after that will be treated as abandoned property and either thrown away or donated tomorrow morning." While I spoke, Mr. Miller had already begun removing the front door hardware. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hallway. nearly drowning out Brenda's rising voice as she shouted in disbelief. The house erupted into chaos. Brenda rushed for her phone and immediately called Sarah. Larry began yelling from the living room while the three cousins scrambled in different directions, gathering clothes, bags, and half-packed belongings. Through Brenda's phone, I could hear Sarah shouting loudly enough that even I could make out fragments of her anger, accusing me of losing my mind and insisting I had no right to do this. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain. I simply stood in the hallway with my hands resting inside my coat pockets, quietly watching everything unfold. By then, every emotional reaction had already passed. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't hurt. What remained was something much simpler: logistics. People often assume quiet decisions come from weakness. In reality, the quietest decisions are often the ones made after every emotional argument has already ended inside your own mind. As the minutes passed, Brenda stuffed clothes into plastic garbage bags without bothering to fold them. Larry wandered from room to room searching for shoes, muttering complaints under his breath while blaming everyone except himself. Their relatives hurried through the cabin collecting whatever they could carry, all while continuing to argue among themselves about whose belongings belonged in which bag. For the first time since I had walked through my own front door and found strangers celebrating inside it, I realized something important. They no longer had any power over me. The moment I stopped asking for their understanding, approval, or agreement, they lost the ability to control how I felt. Exactly 30 minutes later, the new locks were installed. Mr. Miller handed me a fresh set of keys while Brenda, Larry, and the rest of their family stood outside on the chilly driveway surrounded by suitcases, plastic bags, and loose belongings piled around their feet. I thanked the locksmith for his work. Then I stepped back inside the cabin. Without saying another word, I closed the front door, locked it with the brand new deadbolt, and switched off the porch light. Standing quietly beside the front window, I watched as the group remained outside, arguing among themselves for several more minutes before finally loading everything into their vehicles. One by one, the engines started, headlights swept across the driveway, and eventually the last car disappeared down the mountain road. Only then did the silence return. Real silence. The following morning, I met the realtor exactly as originally planned. The cabin needed attention. Pizza boxes still filled the trash. Several rooms required deep cleaning, and wine stains marked parts of the hardwood floor. But structurally, the property was in excellent condition. I hired a professional cleaning company immediately and instructed a contractor to install a separate lock on the wine cellar before any tenants moved in. By early afternoon, every necessary repair had already been scheduled. When I returned to Charlotte later that day, Jason was waiting outside my townhouse. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and it was obvious he hadn't slept much since our conversation. The moment I unlocked the front door, he looked at me and asked quietly, "Mom, what did you do Brenda and the others had to check into a cheap motel? Sarah's been screaming at me all day. She says you humiliated her family." I invited him inside before answering. "I didn't humiliate anyone. Jason." I hung my coat neatly by the door before turning toward him. I protected my property. He followed me into the kitchen, lowering himself into a chair while rubbing both hands across his face. "We don't have money for a motel," he admitted. "And now the closing costs for the new house are due. If we can't pay them, we'll lose the house." I sat across from him and folded my hands calmly on the table. "That's unfortunate," I said, "but the two of you are adults. Sarah has always been very confident managing everyone's future, so I'm sure the two of you can find another solution." He gave a tired, bitter laugh. "You know her parents don't have any money." I nodded. "I do." Then I held his gaze. "And that's exactly why I refuse to let you build your future with mine." Jason lowered his eyes. clearly understanding there wasn't an easy answer to what I'd just said. After several long moments of silence, I leaned forward and placed a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table between us. It wasn't a complicated legal contract drafted by an attorney. It was simply a written agreement outlining the conditions under which I was still willing to help my family. "I'll release the money for your down payment," I told him calmly. "But things are going to be different from now on." He looked down at the page without touching it. "The mountain cabin will be managed exclusively by a professional rental agency," I continued. "Neither you nor Sarah will have a key, and no one stays there unless they're paying tenants approved through the agency. In addition, Sarah owes me a written apology for the way she treated me and for allowing her parents to behave as though my property already belonged to them. Until those conditions are met, the savings account stays exactly where it is." Jason remained completely still. He didn't argue because he already knew the real obstacle wasn't me. It was Sarah. He understood better than anyone that asking her to apologize would be far more difficult than asking me for financial help. Even so, he also recognized something else. For the first time in years, I wasn't changing my position simply because someone else was uncomfortable. He folded the paper carefully before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "I'll talk to her," he said quietly. "I hope you do." That was the end of the conversation. For the next 2 weeks, I heard almost nothing from either of them. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt strategic. Sarah had always believed every disagreement could eventually be resolved if enough pressure was applied. When direct confrontation failed, she simply changed tactics. A few days later, my phone began filling with photographs of my grandchildren playing in the park, drawings they'd made at school, and cheerful messages telling me how much they missed their Nana. Reading those messages wasn't easy. I loved those children more than words could express, and every photograph tugged at my heart. At the same time, I recognized exactly what was happening. The children themselves weren't manipulating me, but their images had become tools in a conversation that had nothing to do with them. I refused to let that happen. My reply remained warm but brief. "I miss them too. As soon as everything involving the cabin has been resolved, I'd love to spend time with them again." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply refused to reward manipulation with the result it was designed to achieve. A few days later, the phone rang again. This time it was Jason. His voice sounded strained before he even spoke. "Mom," he said quietly, "we lost the house." I already knew what he meant. The purchase agreement had expired because the down payment never arrived, and the sellers had accepted another buyer instead. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling genuine sadness for my son. Losing a home is painful under any circumstances, especially when you've already imagined building a future inside it. Still, sadness couldn't change the truth. "What happened?" I asked gently. Sarah refused to apologize. He stopped for several seconds before continuing. "She said you were acting like a tyrant." I remained silent long enough for him to hear the calm in my voice before answering. "That was a choice. Jason." Another pause settled between us. Then I quietly added, "Pride doesn't pay a mortgage." He didn't argue. He knew I was right. Not long afterward, everything began unraveling much faster than Sarah had expected. Brenda and Larry could no longer afford the motel where they'd been staying after leaving the cabin, having exhausted what little money they had. They moved into Jason and Sarah's already crowded 2-bedroom apartment. Overnight, the carefully managed image Sarah had worked so hard to maintain disappeared beneath constant tension, financial stress, and too many people trying to share too little space. Arguments became routine. Privacy disappeared. The orderly household Sarah had always insisted on controlling gradually dissolved into frustration. Then, one afternoon, Brenda called me herself. She began with exaggerated compliments, telling me how much she'd always admired my generosity and how family should learn to forgive one another. When flattery failed to produce the response she wanted, her tone quickly shifted toward blame and accusation. I listened for less than a minute. Then I quietly ended the call. Afterward, I blocked her number for years. I would have spent hours replaying that conversation in my head, wondering whether I should have explained myself more carefully or defended my decisions more politely. This time, I felt none of that. I no longer believed every accusation deserved a response. Instead of managing someone else's emotions, I spent my afternoons exactly the way I'd always hoped retirement would feel. Some days I wandered through the art museum downtown. Other afternoons I met old friends for coffee or enjoyed long walks through the botanical gardens. Gradually, I realized how much of my life I'd spent carrying emotional burdens that never truly belonged to me. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, someone knocked quietly on my front door. When I opened it, Jason stood there holding a single suitcase. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "I can't do it anymore, Mom," he admitted softly. "The apartment is packed with Sarah's relatives. Everyone's fighting about money, and somehow every argument ends with my name being blamed." I looked at him for several moments before stepping aside. "You can stay in the guest room," I said. Relief spread across his face almost immediately, but before he spoke, I gently added one condition. "We're not going to spend every evening talking about Sarah, and we're not negotiating about money. This house is my sanctuary, and I'd like it to stay that way." He nodded without hesitation. "I understand," as he carried his suitcase down the hallway toward the guest room. I realized something important had quietly changed, for the first time in many years. The boundaries belonged to me, and everyone else was beginning to understand they were no longer optional. Jason stayed with me for 3 days. Those days passed quietly, almost peacefully. We didn't spend our time reliving every argument or assigning blame for everything that had happened. Instead, we settled into a simple routine of sharing breakfast each morning, eating dinner together in the evenings, and allowing the rest of the day to unfold naturally. Watching him move through the house, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time, away from the constant tension. He finally seemed able to breathe. As the days passed, he began noticing things that had long become ordinary to me. He commented on how quiet the townhouse felt, how organized everything was, and how comforting it was to come home without arguments waiting behind the front door. Our conversations drifted toward books, gardening, and the professional certification course he'd once wanted to pursue before Sarah dismissed it as a waste of time. The more we talked, the more I sensed he was beginning to recognize just how much of his own decision-making he had gradually surrendered over the years. On the 4th morning, a gentle knock sounded at the front door. When I opened it, Sarah stood on the porch looking nothing like the woman who had stormed into my house only weeks earlier. Her hair was untidy, dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and the confidence that had once accompanied every sentence had quietly disappeared. "Is Jason here?" she asked softly. I nodded and told her he was still asleep. She instinctively started to step inside, but I remained standing in the doorway, not out of anger, but because I wanted to make it clear that entering my home was no longer something anyone could simply assume. "What do you need, Sarah?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. Her parents had left and driven to Virginia to stay with her brother because, as she admitted, everything had turned into a disaster. I didn't interrupt or rush to fill the silence. I simply waited, knowing that people often speak most honestly after they've run out of prepared explanations, after several long moments. She lowered her eyes and quietly said, "I'm sorry." She admitted she was sorry about the cabin, sorry for the way her mother had behaved, and sorry for allowing everything to happen in the first place. I studied her expression for a moment before answering. "That's a beginning," I said. but an apology without different behavior is only noise. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. Only then did I step aside and invite her inside. A few minutes later, Jason joined us at the kitchen table. None of us pretended the previous weeks hadn't happened, but none of us tried to revisit every painful detail either. Instead, I calmly explained the decisions I had already made because I wanted the future to be built on clarity instead of assumptions. The savings account for the grandchildren will stay exactly where it belongs, I explained. But from now on, I'll remain the only trustee. That money exists to build their future, not to rescue adults from financial mistakes or support relatives who believe they're entitled to my help. Both of them listened without interrupting. I continued by explaining that if they chose to buy another home someday, I would still be willing to help with the monthly payments. However, the property would remain in my name for the first 5 years. Once they demonstrated consistent financial responsibility over that period, ownership could be transferred. Sarah looked as though she wanted to protest. She turned toward Jason, clearly expecting him to defend her the way he always had before. Instead, he met her eyes and quietly said, "Mom's right. We made this mess, and we don't get to complain about the conditions for fixing it." The room fell silent. Sarah slowly lowered her head because she understood what had changed. The days of treating me as a quiet source of money, property, and endless patience were over. And for the first time, neither of them tried to argue otherwise. The months that followed became a period of steady adjustment rather than dramatic reconciliation. Sarah respected every boundary we had established, even though I could tell it wasn't always easy for her. Meanwhile, the mountain cabin was rented to a lovely couple from Atlanta who cared for the property with genuine respect, and each month's rental income arrived exactly as I'd planned, giving me the financial security I had worked so hard to create for retirement. Several months later, I invited everyone to dinner at a small local bistro. It wasn't pizza served around a cluttered coffee table, but a proper family meal where everyone treated one another with courtesy and respect. Brenda and Larry weren't invited, and Sarah accepted that decision without a single complaint. As we talked about the grandchildren, school, and everyday life, I noticed another important change in Jason. He had enrolled in the professional certification program Sarah once dismissed as unnecessary, and when tuition became due, I offered to help. This time, however, I wrote the check directly to the school because I wanted every dollar I contributed to build something meaningful instead of disappearing into someone else's poor decisions. One afternoon, not long after that dinner, Sarah stopped by alone carrying a simple bouquet of flowers. They weren't expensive, but she'd clearly chosen them with care. After I invited her inside, she thanked me for giving Jason a place to stay when everything had fallen apart. I accepted the flowers with a smile before answering honestly, "I love my son very much, Sarah, but I've also learned to love myself. That's the difference between the woman I used to be and the woman I am now." She looked at me thoughtfully before asking the question that surprised me most. "How did you stay so calm when all of us were pushing against you?" I smiled gently because the answer had become surprisingly simple. "I wasn't calm because I stopped caring," I said. "I was calm because I finally became clear. When you know exactly what belongs to you and you know what you're worth, you don't need anger to defend either one." Neither of us said anything else for a while. We didn't suddenly become close friends, and we certainly didn't erase everything that had happened. What we gained instead was something far more lasting, a mutual understanding that every healthy relationship begins with respecting each other's boundaries. The months that followed didn't transform our family overnight, but they changed it in ways that mattered. There were no dramatic declarations, no miraculous reconciliation, and no sudden promise that everything would return to the way it had once been. Instead, trust was rebuilt through ordinary decisions repeated consistently over time, and I discovered that lasting change is usually much quieter than people expect. Sarah kept the promises she had made. She respected the boundaries surrounding the mountain cabin, never asked for another key, and gradually stopped treating my generosity as something automatically available whenever life became inconvenient. I could still see that surrendering control wasn't easy for her, but she no longer challenged every limit I established, little by little. Respect replaced the entitlement that had once shaped nearly every conversation between us. Jason changed in quieter ways. After completing his certification course, he found a better position with more stability and better pay. What pleased me most wasn't the raise or the new title. It was watching him begin making decisions because they reflected his own judgment rather than simply avoiding conflict. He spoke with more confidence, questioned things he would once have accepted without hesitation, and gradually became the thoughtful, capable man I had always known he could be. Several months later, they found another home they genuinely loved. This time, the process looked completely different from before. They asked for my advice instead of my permission, discussed their finances honestly, and never assumed my money or property belonged in their plans unless I chose to offer help. As we'd agreed, I contributed toward the monthly payments while keeping the deed in my name during the first 5 years. It wasn't because I expected them to fail. It was because trust, once broken, deserves time to grow back through actions rather than promises. The mountain cabin flourished under the care of its new tenants. Every few weeks they sent me photographs of the property, showing flower beds they'd carefully maintained, fresh paint on the porch railing, or the first snowfall settling across the roof. Every picture reminded me that people treat things differently when they understand they are caring for someone else's home instead of assuming it already belongs to them. One evening, I organized a family dinner at a small local bistro. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the afternoon I had walked into my cabin and found strangers treating it like their own vacation house. We shared a proper meal, talked about the grandchildren, laughed over ordinary family stories, and simply enjoyed one another's company. Brenda and Larry weren't invited, and no one questioned that decision. Sarah accepted it without complaint because she finally understood that forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, and respect sometimes means accepting limits without asking them to change. Not long afterward, Sarah came to visit by herself, carrying another small bouquet of flowers. They weren't extravagant, but she'd chosen them thoughtfully, just as she had the first time. As we arranged them in a vase on the kitchen table, she thanked me once again for helping Jason when everything in their lives had been falling apart. "I didn't understand before," she admitted quietly. "I thought kindness meant people would always say yes." I smiled gently. "I used to believe that too." She looked at me for a moment before asking, "So what changed?" I rested my hands lightly against the edge of the table before answering. I finally realized that kindness without boundaries eventually stops being kindness. It becomes expectation. And once people begin expecting everything, they stop appreciating anything. She nodded slowly. This time, I believed the lesson had truly reached her. Today, I spend my mornings tending the garden outside my townhouse or driving into the mountains to visit the cabin whenever it's between tenants. Sometimes I sit on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the wind move through the pine trees while looking at the old cherry wood furniture resting exactly where it belongs. The cabin smells of fresh mountain air instead of stale pizza boxes, and every visit reminds me why protecting it was never about the building itself. It was about protecting the life I had spent decades creating. People occasionally ask whether I regret risking my relationship with my only son over a piece of property. My answer is always the same. I never chose a cabin over my family. I chose honesty over entitlement, respect over assumption, and healthy boundaries over quiet resentment. In the end, those choices didn't destroy my family. They gave us the opportunity to rebuild it on a stronger foundation than we had ever known before. Now, when I unlock the cabin door with the only set of keys that truly belongs to me, I no longer think about the afternoon I found strangers drinking my wine and claiming my future. Instead, I think about everything that happened afterward. I think about the peace that returned once I stopped apologizing for protecting what was mine. And I remember that the greatest inheritance I could ever leave my family isn't a mountain cabin or a savings account. It's the example of a woman who finally understood that love and self-respect were never meant to compete with each other. Once I learned that lesson, I stopped giving away pieces of myself simply to keep everyone else comfortable, and that freedom has become the most valuable thing I've ever owned. As I look back on everything that happened, I realize the mountain cabin was never the true prize. It simply became the place where I finally remembered that kindness is most meaningful when it is freely given, not quietly expected. The moment I stopped confusing love with unlimited sacrifice. I didn't lose my family. I gave our relationships the chance to become healthier, more honest, and built on genuine respect instead of entitlement. If my story leaves you with one lesson, I hope it's this: never be afraid to protect the life you've spent years building. The people who truly love you may not understand your boundaries at first, but in time they will learn to respect them. Real family isn't measured by who has access to your home, your money, or your generosity. It's measured by who respects your right to say yes, your right to say no, and your right to live your own life with dignity. Thank you for spending your time with Quiet Revenge Stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about quiet strength, family drama, and the power of self-respect. We'll see you in the next Quiet Revenge story.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful: love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.